Flack Talk with James Canning, the podcast with the inside scoop on journalists from San Diego and across the nation. If you're a communications pro, have a nose for news, or you're just nosy, this is the podcast for you. Now here's your host, James Canning.
Hey there. As I started to socialize the idea that I was thinking about doing a podcast where I, as a communications person, would actually talk to journalists about their careers and lives, people kept asking me why. Like, journalists are the ones who are supposed to be asking the questions and you're supposed to be answering them. And the fact is, I've always been a people person. That's why I got in this profession, public relations. Now, at that time, early on, little did I know what it really entailed. I just thought I'd get to talk a lot, which from the little notes that my teachers in high school and grade school used to put on my report cards that I talk too much, seemed like a good path. And then I went to college at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. And that's where I got my degree in public relations. Now, there are degrees in public relations. People sometimes think you just fall into this career or you're a journalist and then you become a PR person, which happens. But I actually went to school and got my degree in public relations. Now, what I didn't realize when I started down that journey at Wayne State was the important role and the skills I would gain in my classes, in particular the journalism classes. Those classes that I took played a significant role in my career thus far. And so, I had this professor who was my writing class professor. It was a journalism writing class, and she was a real live journalist. Like, she was out there telling stories and then coming in and teaching us as a class how to write as a journalist. I had no idea the close relationship that journalists and PR people had. Now, I knew they worked together, but I just didn't know kind of how much crossover there really was. And I remember, I think it was my first assignment in Sandra's class. Sandra's the name of the professor who taught the writing class. It was an article about that we had to write, and I think it was about ourselves. It might have been about something else, but I'd never done that before. And so I'd done some academic papers, obviously in high school and things like that, but I wrote this article. It was like so many words and so forth, and I did it in first person. And I turned it in, and I got it back, and it failed. And it was a really humbling experience for me, because at that moment, I started to understand the difference in writing, what was journalistic writing, what was academic writing, the difference between a normal news article versus a column, and in addition to that, really, I learned how to be inquisitive. I learned that you're going to have to interact with all types of people in these careers, whether you're a journalist or a PR person. And the lessons I learned there were invaluable. Now, most of my classmates were journalism majors, but there was a few of us PR people, and Sandra did a really good job of, making sure we felt included and explaining how there's crossover between what journalists do and PR people do and how these skills are very transferable. And so fast forward to my first job out of college, I was really lucky. I got a chance to work at a public relations firm fresh out of school. And there was this guy, he was one of the partners in the firm, and his name was Bob Berg. And he was a former journalist. And after his journalism career, he had an opportunity to become the press person for Michigan Governor William Milliken. And then later on down the line, he actually became the spokesperson, the press secretary for Detroit's first black mayor, Coleman Alexander Young. And Bob's well known in Detroit circles. Unfortunately, he's passed away. But Bob's a tall, slender guy with a beard. Somewhat soft spoken. He looked at you kind of inquisitively. He thought a lot before he spoke, which was something, especially early on, I wasn't used to. I just spoke. Sometimes I still do it. But he early on was really helpful in shaping, my writing, continued to kind of grow in there. But then also just what you had to do as a PR person in the business of public relations, from interacting with clients to creating a plan. But one of the most important things he ever taught me was about, maintaining your credibility, as a PR person. He said, your client could be going through hell and they could be dealing with what seems to be, one of the most devastating situations in their lives, professional or personal. And he's like, and you're in it with them, right? You're dealing with that. You're head down, you're grinding on it. He says, but, as a representative, you kind of got to hover above it. You kind of got to get out of the fray. And you have a responsibility to them to always try to be level-headed. Sometimes that means, you're the level-headed one, but you still got to go to battle with journalists. You still got to talk with them. You still got to maybe not see the same point of view. But no matter what you do in those moments, maybe where you're, butting heads, don't compromise your personal integrity to make a point. And he taught me, you're no good to your boss or your client if you lose the respect of the journalist you're working with. And this really, it stuck with me as a journalist himself, and then becoming a public relations person, he knew. And so, and he told me, he says, look, it doesn't matter, behind the scenes, your boss or your client, they could be talking, swearing up and down, the media is the devil. They could call them a bunch of mother effers, all these kind of things. And you listen, right? You provide guidance. In some cases, you console. And then you do your job. You step out there on their behalf. You communicate with the journalists. You share the information that's important for people to know. And you maintain your credibility and not compromise your integrity. And given some of the sticky situations that I've dealt with in my public relations career, both in the public sector and the private sector, this was some of the best advice I got. And during every tough moment, I really gained a greater respect for the role of journalists. They got to ask hard questions. Sometimes it's not comfortable for them. They've told me that personally. And so I've made it a point in my personal life to try to connect with journalists beyond, this transactional moment that sometimes can seem, you send an email, you ask them to write a story. There's more to it than that. And so oftentimes the journalists that I've come in contact with, I meet them through my professional work. But I make it a point to try to be personal with them. Those that are willing, I want to get to know them. I want to understand what makes them tick. Why do they do this? What makes them drive toward, sharing a good story? And that helps me, my job in some respects, but more so it helps me be a good human. And even in all those conversations that we have, I understand that there are lines. And, I always early on lay the groundwork that, look, especially if we're going to work together at any point, I understand that they got a job to do. They got to ask me tough questions. They ain't always going to be things that I like. And I want them to know that I understand what they have to do. And while we might not always agree and we might butt heads a little bit, I respect them and the institution of journalism. So, why did I start this podcast? Why is Flack Talk a thing? Well, you see, when I got to San Diego in 2018, I didn't know anyone. I moved here without a job. I was doing a lot of networking, trying to figure out where I would land for a job. Well, then at one point I get a job 3 months in, and I'd been reading the papers and getting to know the community a little bit that way. But then I started actually taking meetings with journalists. I had lunches and coffees and so forth. And as I had those meetings, we talked a lot about work. But I tried to take some time to get to understand who they were. Did they have families? Were they from this area? What types of beats were they most interested in? Where did they go to school? I wanted to know about them if they were willing to share. And during those conversations, just like you do with any other person, I started to really find some fascinating tidbits and information about them. There were some people that I connected with on very personal levels, in the sense of we had similar backgrounds or upbringings or went through similar situations, and then there was people I didn't know who had families and children who, were doting parents, and it was great to hear, how much they love that in addition to their career. And so I felt like, I fed off of that. And so I decided that why don't I help tell journalist stories. I'm a PR guy. I am a hype machine. And I think right now, especially in this time where there's, concerns people have about fake news and the integrity of journalism and whether it's real and needed, here I am, a guy who, is sometimes looked at as the dark side, a PR guy, on the other side of journalists. But I think that there's stories to tell. And I think these folks deserve to have their stories heard for those who want to share them. And so I said, well, why don't I create a platform to help start telling the stories of journalists? And that's how Flack Talk came to be.
If you liked Flack Talk and want to learn more about your favorite muckrakers and newsbreakers, please hit the subscribe button or visit flacktalk.com. New Flack Talk episodes with James Canning air every other week, wherever you get your podcasts.